Welcome back to this series on building a Note app with Firebase. In this episode, we'll be focusing on setting up login and authentication for our app. By the end of this video, you'll have a fully functioning login and sign-up system using Firebase Authentication. Let's take a look at the plan from the previous episode. Since we finished the first part of the plan, we can cross that off. In this episode, we're going to handle the login and authentication. That includes switching on the correct authentication method in Firebase. In our project, we'll be using an email and password, but you can use whichever one you want. Building the login and sign up page, connecting the form for Firebase to handle. First, let's head over to the Firebase console. Navigate to the authentication section from the sidebar. Click on Get Started, and you'll be brought to the Sign In Method tab. Here, we'll enable email password authentication. Click Save, and we're done with this step. With that installed, let's create our authentication context. For those of you that might be unsure what an auth context means, imagine auth context as a central hub in your app that securely stores your user login information. This makes it easy for all authorized components to access this info and update their behavior based on the user's login state. In our source folder, create a new folder called Contexts. Inside the context, create a file named authcontext.tsx. This file will handle the authentication state for our app. Let's start with the imports. At the top of the auth.context.tsx file, we import necessary dependencies from React and Firebase. Next, we'll define an interface for our context type, auth.context_type, which has a current user that could either be user or null. Then we create the auth context using createContext and initialize it to be undefined. We then create a custom hook, useAuth, which allows our components to easily access the authentication context. If the context is undefined, we'll throw an error to ensure the hook is only used within the auth provider. Well, let's talk about our auth provider component. This component is like a wrapper that provides authentication information to other parts of the app. It takes a special prop called children. We can pass any component as a child to the auth provider. This child will access everything in the context, such as the login, logout, and create account function. We also initialize two pieces of state, current user to keep track of the logged in user, and loading to manage the loading state. Inside a useEffect hook, we set up a listener using Firebase's onAuth state changed. This function updates current user whenever the authentication state changes and sets loading to false once the initial state is determined. We then create an object called value that holds the current user. We use this weird kind of syntax so we can pass the current user as an object in the auth context provider. This value is provided to all the children of the auth context provider, so we always know who's signed in. The loading state ensures that we don't render the children until the authentication state is determined. Finally, we export a handle logout function to sign out the user. This function calls Firebase's signout method on the auth object. Next, let's create our login and signup component. In the source folder, create two folders called signin and signup. Create two files, signin.tsx and signin.css. And the same thing for signup. Let's walk through our signin.tsx file and highlight some key areas that might be tricky for beginners. Luckily for us, the code in the sign-in page is very similar to the sign-up page. First, we introduce all the necessary imports that we need. Then we use the useState hook to create a state variable for email, password, and error. This allows us to track the user's input and any error messages. We use the useNavigate hook from React Router DOM to handle navigation. Inside the useEffect hook, we listen to the changes from the authentication state. If a user is already logged in, we automatically redirect them to the home page. The handle login function is triggered when the login form is submitted. It prevents the default form submission behavior, tries to sign in with Firebase, and catch any errors. The form includes input fields for email and password, and displays any error messages. It also includes a link to the sign-up page. These components provide forms for user login and sign-up. When the form is submitted, it calls the appropriate function from our auth context to handle authentication. Go ahead and copy the login page. Then we're going to make the appropriate changes to make it look like a real sign-up page. Rename the functions so it's easier to maintain later. we're going to modify the button at the bottom of the login page. Export a new signup page component. Don't forget to replace the text here like I did. Back in the website, we can see the page is already coming together. Now to style it, copy the CSS you see on the screen, or go into the GitHub from the description below. Then do the same thing for the sign in CSS page. Finally, let's integrate these components with our app's routing. Remove the current imports and all the JSX. Then we need to make some syntax changes to the component creation. The app component is now wrapped with auth provider and router. This setup ensures the authentication context and routing are available throughout the application. Within the router, we define 3 routes: login, signup, / renders app content, which conditionally renders either home or signup based on the user's authentication state. We import browser router routes and route from React Router DOM to handle client-side routing. The auth provider and useauth are imported from our custom authentication context to manage user authentication state. Additionally, we import 3 new components: home, login, and signup. To support these changes, we also create the home file. Let's take a look at this new file. Now in home.tsx, let's create this mock design so we can test the app. As you can see here, we can now navigate between the 2 pages. That's good. Go into app.css and give all div and input components this styling. Border box simplifies the calculations of an element's width and height, making your layout more responsive and flexible. That's it for the episode, and created login and signup forms. In the next episode, we'll dive into creating notebooks and storing them with Firestore.